We haven't found anything yet, but this is a very difficult test. I mean, it's as hard as trying to find a needle in a thorny, ocean-sized haystack.
A trained journalist, history expert, and combat photographer in Central America, Cork has 3 decades of treasure hunting experience that began when he was 18.
I went after Captain Kidd's treasure on an island off the west coast of Vietnam. It was an illegal, covert operation. We got caught. When I paid the price, ended up spending 11 months in a Vietnamese prison. It was one of the darkest moments of my life. I was held for 11 months, and 7 of those I was in solitary confinement. Boy, when you've seen a foreign prison and you're a foreigner in a foreign prison, I mean, it's a world that you don't want to go into.
Touch me first. Don't fucking touch me.
Oh, really?
Hey, that's enough. That's enough. The fuck is going on?
Is the weight going?
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
Exactly. What the fuck happened back then in 2016? I mean, is that the normal procedure on a major production for Discovery Channel? Where I was starring as on the show that was the 2015 new hit series for Discovery Channel? There were a lot of questions back then. Everybody asking, what happened to that show? It only lasted like three seasons. And most of the cast, except for one, were not on that 3rd season. What happened? Now, if you've already read my book about the experience, So You Want to Be a Reality TV Star, everything I learned about sex, drugs, fraud, rock and roll, and Vipers as team leader of Discovery Channel's Treasure Quest Snake Island, you already know the whole story. But for those of you who don't worry. We'll talk about that in a later episode. But right now, this is just my introductory. I wanted to say hello and welcome to Cork's Critical Thinking Corner. This is where we're going to be talking about the world events, how they're going to affect you, and hopefully I'll be able to impart information that will help you in deal with things such as a zombie apocalypse. A zombie apocalypse? Oh yeah. How could that be? You ever seen somebody hungry? They're just like zombies, just like in Walking Dead. Or actually, it'd be more like World War Z, where they aren't just walking, they're running. And they're running to take your stuff. Something bright and cheery to be looking forward to, brought to you by people like Klaus Schwab, the WEF, Trudeau, Biden, all these other people that hopefully I won't get censored too quickly. But I hope you'll also enjoy the show. And we'll be talking about a variety of things like, why is it that over the years, a government that was, and a society that was ingrained with the idea of learning how to catch a fish has become so much more concentrated on giving you the fish, and how that giving you the fish has led to where we are right now, where when the government is unable to give you that fish, and that means even to the point that FEMA can't even bring you something to keep you going, that you're SOL. That's a major setup, and how institutions that initially were designed in order to protect humans are actually getting to the point that I think they're getting to the point where they're actually leading us down the road of thinning along the lines of the reset. And what does the reset really mean? We'll talk about war. How there was a time where my having been a combat veteran was actually a very unique experience for somebody who went through combat in the 80s as an American. But we're getting to a situation where that will be actually very commonplace, where people around the world will have their own combat experiences, and it won't be this left against right, country against country, party against party. It'll actually be those who have against those who do not. And it'll be neighbor to neighbor. It'll be neighborhoods to neighborhoods. It's that wild that we have gotten to that point. But if you study the Tytler cycle, if you study generational theory, or there's a book on it titled The Fourth Turning. It's all in there. It talks all about how, especially republics, have a 250-year cycle, And when that happens, this is the thing that I think people are going to be very concerned about, is that we're hearing all this banter back and forth. Well, it's going to be a really bad recession. It's going to be a really bad recession. Or like people tell me, yeah, it's going to be like your father. When your father, like my father went through the Great Depression. He survived the Great Depression. I used to hear the horror stories of what it was like to live in Spokane, Washington, and have to go through the Great Depression during that time period. And he was lucky. He had an uncle who had a country store, and they were able to actually augment their food supply from canned goods that his uncle was able to provide to the family, right? And also he raised rabbits. And actually, if you read my book, that actually was the international bestseller back in, 2004, The Bamboo Chest, now in its second edition over on Amazon, just like my other books. And I'll be coming out with a variety of books, smaller books, more instructional books on homesteading, on self-defense, on combat. I've actually got a couple of books already on combat, but they were actually designed for countries who are going to have to deal with the invasion of other countries. I wrote that when I was on my way to Lithuania, Poland, Estonia, all these other countries who I knew back then, which was 2016, were going to have to get ready for what was coming. And guess what? They're at it right now. Germany's probably going to be next, but is actually dealing with it right now in terms of trying to stay warm this winter. Which is interesting that they have an aversion to calling firewood. They prefer to call it biomass. They're going to heat the homes in Germany with biomass, and the reason is because they think it's below them that they are now going back 100 years. Me, I'm actually happy that where I live and that I returned to Alaska. That's the question you should be asking. Why is that somebody who was raised as a city mouse has become a country mouse and became a country mouse 10 years ago? And the reason is because I came back in 2007 to my home in Nob Hill from a teaching contract for the Korean Army. And that's right when they had a 25-cent fuel increase. And that fuel increase led to the shelves of the local Nob Hill supermarket being empty. And that was just a 25-cent fuel increase. But I knew back then, I said, if that's only a 25-cent fuel increase, what's going to happen when something real happens? And guess what? That real is happening now. And you're watching it develop. So we'll be talking about that, how you can prepare for what's coming. And hopefully, I pray to God that you've already got out of the city. And you're also going to deal with the idea that there are people that you care about that you would like to get out of the city, but they just want to live in the city. They can't get out of the city. They can't deal with the idea that you have to live in the country and live in the quiet of the country, or that you have to go and hunt and fish and raise pigs and chickens and plant stuff like broccoli, whatever, to keep you going. I'll talk about how the different governments have been messing with our food. Mainly the governments as the result of the corporations, and how these food corporations have been slowly poisoning you. We'll talk about food and how that's actually been a campaign in order to thin us all out. What better way than to make you fat and stupid so that you're easily pliable? And you're easily pliable through such venues as Treasure Quest Snake Island. Think about that. When I wrote this book not just the idea of being a tell-all about the reality TV industry. I wrote this book as a warning that it's actually just like, when you're going to invade a country and you've got a beachhead, the first thing you want to do is you want to soften it up with artillery and bombing. Well, what? The powers that be, some evil, evil people, which I like to call the evil empire, have softened you up, the rest of the populace, by giving you content, media, that is seemingly innocuous because you're just watching a show. But when the show is actually designed to dumb you down and make you not question things, make you not pick up a book. I mean, one of the most horrific experiences I had was realizing, as I was reading through the fan base on Facebook for Treasure Quest, that one of the fans of the show said that Treasure Quest Snake Island was actually an example of why this person did not have to crack open a book and read it to find out about history. When I saw that, I said, we are screwed. We are totally screwed. Because I knew he wasn't by himself and that there were many more. And many more of these people are out there, and they're basically going to be fodder. Or, as I like to say, they're just going to be fresh meat. Because what's going to be happening, just think about what's happening right now where the WEF and Klaus Schwab and all these crazy motherfuckers are telling you that it's okay to just live off bugs. And they're actually prepping you to get okay with cannibalism. We'll talk about a book that I'm enjoying reading called Fat of the Land. It was written by a Norwegian. Came out in the early 60s. I think the first edition came out in the early 50s. And actually, he was an opponent of Alan Keyes. And you should know who Alan Keyes was. This guy was the guy who basically designed the type of diet that we are now suffering from, where we have a level of obesity that people can't even imagine. And you got to wonder, I wonder, are they fattening us up just to have that extra fat so that cannibalism actually is the go-to experience for a lot of people because they're going to save all the beef for all the wealthy and the elite who are going to have all the ranches like Bill Gates and all these others who've been buying up all the land around the country and wiping out the local farmer. So if you don't have your own land in order to raise your own food, like we do, those of us who are living in the country in Alaska where we hunt tomorrow, I'll be doing a shorty tomorrow from the field because tomorrow's opening day for moose season out here on the Kenai Peninsula. And it's also the waterfowl opener. So it's a decision. Do I grab my shotgun or do I grab my 338-06? And I'll give you a little shorty. So I'll be offering this content in two forms. Tuesdays and Thursdays will be like today, where it'll be a full show. And on the other days, I'll try to keep contact coming where it'll basically me carrying my cell phone with me and shooting video in the field and making comment about what's been happening that day, because the whole idea, it is about news. You know, it's kind of like one of the things that I've been noticing. It's like we got to be very careful about what we're looking at, because I notice there's a lot of false prophets out there who are giving information. One of them I find very interesting because he actually has good content. It's this guy called Jeremiah Babe. I've been watching him for freaking months. And the interesting thing, the question that always keeps on popping in my mind is like, this guy is actually, he's on the ball. He's bringing the content. He's bringing the info. He's showing you how the market's going. But the wild thing about it is, why is this guy still living in Palm Springs? Think about it. I moved back to Alaska, a place that I moved to initially to deal with post-traumatic stress resulting from my 5 years in combat in Central America in the 80s. I moved back here because when I first lived here back in the early 90s, I lived as a hunting and fishing subsistence hunter and fisherman. So I lived off the land while I was up here. That's the reason I came back here, is because I knew I could live off the land up here. You know, I might have been able to do it back in Montana, Idaho, northeastern Washington, remote parts of Oregon. It's getting harder in Oregon. Parts of California, you can still do that, like way up north, right at the Oregon border. But it's getting harder and harder because there's so many people, and there's so many people coming into the places that are prime, right? But you got somebody like Jeremiah Babe, who's living in Palm Springs. Of all the places, that's the next worst place to be living right now, is this is going to go down. And when I say it's going to go down, it's going to go down by this winter at the latest. You're going to start seeing the threads of it beginning. Yeah, probably about October, end of October, about November. Right when it starts to get cold and people have to stay warm. You're already seeing it over in Europe right now where they don't want to have that biomass. You know, over in Poland where you've got truck lines and people in their own personal vehicles driving up to the coal plant trying to go get coal to be able to keep their houses warm this winter, getting their ration. So we'll talk about that. I also have my other channel you've seen. I've got two other channels that you should go check out because they're actually leading up towards this. And for some of them, you know, the Treasure Quest Snake Island, the real story, that talks about the show. That's fine. It gives you the whole stuff about Joe Rogan and all the fakery that happens, Tim Kennedy and all that fakery that just disgusts me, because it's like we were filming in the same place that Tim Kennedy had his Hunting Hitler show. Yeah. And if you didn't recognize it, you should really pick up a copy of this book, because I've got snapshots. Oh, man. How does it feel to be freaking right on the precipice of the major and the final zombie apocalypse. And like I say, this is not going to be like the Great Depression that my father went through, or your father may have gone through, your grandfather, or for sure your great-grandfather probably went through. This is going to be something that I don't think anybody's alive has gone through. This is going to be a civilization buster. You're already seeing that because they are stopping certain infrastructures that just in order to get them going again will take about 2 years. Well, once the other parts of the table, all the other legs start breaking off, you won't be able to have those 2 years to come back and get that infrastructure running back up again. That's why you should be concerned. That's the reason you should be already preparing. You should not be living in an urban area. I'll tell you why you shouldn't be living in an urban area. I was in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism in Central America. We'll talk about that in the future, how I was a paramilitary officer and how I ran with the Salvadoran Navy SEALs and the Salvadoran Army Special Forces in various groups, the PRAL, the LERPs of El Salvador during the war, and why I was tagging along and why I had my own units that were pseudo-operation oriented. Why we were doing that kind of stuff. The last war against communism. Who knew that while we were fighting the kinetic war against communism, the guys learned how to get rid of their look and remove the red stars and the long hair and the beard and stop looking like Che Guevara, and they started putting on suits and ties, and they went into Wall Street and they went into Washington. And by doing that, they have led the country to where we are right now, which is they're achieving what they never could have achieved militarily by having gone into the direction of this country, causing us to remove fossil fuels when we're not ready to get off fossil fuels, using lies about climate change and how we can affect it. We can't affect climate change. Look at a book. Read about what it was like during the time of William Shakespeare and how they were freezing their butts off. Or, personally, I'm a descendant of a Mayflower passenger. The Fullers, Samuel Fuller and his kid. So what was it like for them when they arrived? Remember, they were going to freeze to death if it wasn't for the natives who helped them get their planting going, right? And why and how did that lead to other things that are going to be happening in this country? And it's kind of terrifying because it's not going to be a side against a side, like I said, in terms of a war. What is it going to be? It's going to be basically the Dark Ages. That's why I'm saying this is not going to be the Great Depression of the 1930s or any of the previous depressions of the American economy that go back all the way to just before or just after the War of 1812. We've had many depressions, many Great Depressions, right? But what we haven't had in a long time is a basic civilization buster. The last one we've had in the West was the fall of Rome. And we're there right now. The destroying of statues by the barbarians. Yeah, just like in Rome when they said, hey, we got to help and take care of the Visigoths because, we're just going to be like friendly because we have so much wealth here in Rome. We got to share it with the people. Yeah, so those people came in and they started yanking down the statues of all the important people of Roman history. And that began the process of the destruction of the Roman civilization. And this is where you're going to have to be thinking ahead, and that is that the technologies that the Romans had, those who were smart enough in the distant colonies under the empire, the Roman Empire, such as in England and in France and fringes of Germany, they still had those. And from that, you had the resulting new civilizations that came about, such as under Charlemagne. History. That's why they're trying to destroy it for us, because they don't want us to know what happened. They don't want to know how Plymouth Rock occurred. They don't want to know, like my ancestors, David and Andrew Graham, who fought at the American Revolution, during the American Revolution at Kings Mountain, which if you went through sniper training, you should be very well acquainted about that example of great marksmanship of the Americans or the American colonists, because people forget that wasn't America against England. That was actually British citizens against British citizens. That was a civil war. It wasn't a revolution. It was a civil war. And here we are in this situation where we have some major concerns about what's happening, where we have a dictator telling us what to do, where everything that was written in the American Constitution is actually quickly being destroyed. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about your diet and how they've been messing with your diet to make you more easily compliant, such as meat. Don't eat meat. You know which is the easiest way to remember something about meat and how if you remove meat from a person's diet, they become more compliant? Just go read Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Or watch the movie, the musical that came out in the 60s when I was a kid. I watched it, and that's the one I always refer because, you know, you can't give meat to the children because they'll get uppity. Yeah, that's true. Watch how they're playing with our diet. Watch how they're playing with our Constitution. Watch how they're playing with our laws. And watch how they're trying to enslave us by making you work harder and harder for less return. So I talked about Jeremiah Babe. Why is Jeremiah Babe still living in Palm Springs of all places? Are you living in Las Vegas? Are you living in San Francisco? Are you living in Los Angeles? Wow. To me, that's a death wish. Because if you're living in any of these towns, especially those kinds of towns, if you're still living in Seattle, you're still living in Portland, you don't have any land that you can plant. And when I say land that you can plant, look at the old movies. And when I say old movies, I'm not even talking about back in the 20s and 30s. I'm talking about watch movies from pre-90s where you have a skyline and they'll shoot a scene on top of an apartment or an office complex. And there'll be little gardens where people were planting, even though they lived in the city, they were planting food. You know, what are the origins of the dry goods store? That's where people went to buy. They didn't have supermarkets. You grew your own food. You went to the dry goods store to go get tools. It was the hardware store. It was everything. The dry goods and the hardware, they were the same place. They were the store, the local store, the country store. You went and bought your tools. You bought your spades. You bought your shovels. You bought your seed. You bought canned goods. You bought beans. You bought rice. The dry goods. But you didn't buy veggies. You didn't buy meat. You went to the butcher to buy meat. But in the city, it had to be imported, except for people who raise their own chickens and raise their own pigeons. Pigeons was a big thing. That's why there's so many pigeons, but nobody's eating them. They'll start eating them quick. And for you people who are living in the South and you've got pigs, you should be overjoyed. It might be a complaint right now, but get ready. Soon, you'll be so lucky that you've got wild pig that you can actually trap and feed yourself with. And why is that happening? It's happening because of all these actions by people who have so much wealth, which is funny because they think they're going to get away from this too. But if you study Roman history and you even study medieval history, you know that there are royal names that are no longer being used. And those names are because they were wiped out. They are gone because they were wiped out. They were wiped out either because of a plague or they were wiped out through starvation or they're wiped out because of some kind of conflict. It's coming back. The old ways are coming back. And the question is, how are you going to be prepared for that? We're going to talk about the emasculation of the male. They've been doing this in order to make you more and more pliable. They've been doing it through media by making guys wear dresses and transgender. Did you know that while everybody, like you've got like Jordan Peterson and you've got Congress talking about transgender and all this kind of stuff and debating back and forth, that's the same conversation that the Roman Senate was having while they were burning, while Rome was burning. That's what the Senate was talking about. Think about those things. There is nothing new in history. And if you're smart has nothing to do with being, oh, I'm super intelligent. It's the idea that you know where you come from, you know the history, and you know the history of history. You know the history of nations. You know how nations end up in turmoil. You know how nations ended in times of abundance. Because the abundance that we've had is because of very intelligent people who got together and got a coalition together and were able to bring something wonderful, a sense and experience of wealth that people previously could never have imagined. To tell my grandparents who are dead, 2 decades ago, what we have technologically, they couldn't even have imagined it. Or even when I was a kid, thinking back on, we were watching Star Trek and they were talking about communicators, and we have cell phones. that our technology has arrived at that point, but whereby next year you might be having to club a rabbit on the back of the head to feed your kids. That you or your parents were probably thinking that that meat that you bought at the supermarket came out of a machine. Like there are actually people who think that meat comes out of a machine wrapped in cellophane, and that's where it comes from. Instead of some animal either got like a 22 round in the head or got a cattle prod in the head and then was quickly brought up on a gambrel and was split open, gutted, and then the meat was processed. It was skinned and then the meat was processed. That's stuff you learn on a farm. That's what you learn on the ranch. You better get ready to do that again, or be lucky that you've got relatives who've got that. But still, you're going to have to get out of the city to get to that. And the question is, can you afford it? Do you know what the Bennett buggy is? All these people who've been buying all these vehicles, they should Google the Bennett buggy. The Bennett buggy were vehicles like my great-grandfather, William Graham, who had a auto dealership in the 1920s, was selling all these cars back in the 1920s. Well, by the 1930s, they were yanking the engines out of there and hooking them up to horses, because in Canada they call them Bennett buggies. In the United States they call them Hoover buggies, because they couldn't afford the fuel. They couldn't afford to buy the fuel to run those engines, much less pay for the repairs on those vehicles that they bought and everybody was buying in the 1920s. But we're going even further, deeper into that, and that is the idea that our culture and our society has become so devolved and so quickly that something that had taken decades to create and to build is now falling like dust in months, weeks. Kids who have no interest in learning anything, that they're on automatic growth. The next best thing is, can they get on TikTok? Think how they're going to feed themselves. People who have mothers and fathers who have never even learned how to cook, because why should they have to cook? They've made enough money to go and take their family to McDonald's at the bottom, and at the top to a high-end restaurant, and never had to cook at home. Or they paid a chef to cook. But what happens when their economy explodes and it's over? Things we'll be talking about. Globalism, global slavery that's coming. You know, what is it to have free man's land? You know, what is your house your house? Or do you really understand the real in real estate? Real estate, real, it's king's land. That's why you don't really own your land. And why is that? You used to own your land. And in the United States, you used to own your land before they had the Federal Reserve. Why did they create the Federal Reserve? And why is it the Federal Reserve was actually the first step in destroying the United States by creating a central bank? It's kind of like when I was in school. I was always saying, wow, you know, Aaron Burr, he was such an angry old man. And he never looked as good, you know, as like handsome as Alexander Hamilton. So I always felt bad about Alexander Hamilton. These days, shoot, I would have been happy to get in a duel and put a freaking round ball in his head, because he was pro-central bank and Aaron Burr was anti-central bank or a Federal Reserve or federal bank. Because when you get a central bank, that's the way you enslave people. You control the money, you control the people. And they're working on getting it digital. So you should also be checking in and making sure the books that you're getting. I love books. I've got 3,000 books on my iPad. I also download, and we'll be talking about how to secure electronic documents so that you can have access to them if you don't have access to electricity. Something to be thinking about. Oh, there's so many things we'll be talking about in the coming months. Corporate farming, how the corporate farming, I got a hint of it when I was a kid back in California in the 80s, and I'd go out hunting and trying to get access to go pig hunting, which was in contrast to what it was in the 70s. The 70s was really easy. You went, you met the farmer or rancher, and he was delighted you were going to shoot pigs off his property. But then they sold out to corporations, and the corporation was owned by somebody back in England or back in Europe or who knows where. And then it was also being run by people who were illegals, brought up into this country to work on ranches because, hey, they did really well back in Mexico or wherever they came from. And they can't fight back because they're illegally in the country. I mean, the ones who've been benefiting the most in this country of illegals coming in this country have been the wealthy and power elite who've gotten illegal labor at cheap rates. Think about that. Hasn't been for you as a citizen. We'll talk about the military. Why does the military hate the CIA? And why does the CIA think that they're better than the military? There's going to be a lot of things we'll be talking about. So be sure, subscribe, like down below, because the more times you like, more people will know about what I'm talking about. And if you agree with me, definitely like. Double like if you can. Send it over to your friends. Subscribe. That's all I can say. Because the more you subscribe, the more people we get on here, the easier it'll be for me to get the information out. And it'll show me what you want to talk about or want me to go and investigate. Because that's my background. I go and find out things. I found out a lot of things. If you read my book, if you read this book, I found out a lot of things that people wanted to keep secret. And yeah, we'll talk about that. I wish you well, and I'll talk to you on the flip side. Have a good night.